Jake Morrison pressed his face against the small window of the exploration ship, New Horizon, and watched the stars slowly drift by. 8 months he had been stuck inside this metal box, floating through space. 8 long months of breathing recycled air and eating food that came from tubes and packets. 8 months of sleeping in a bed that was barely big enough for his body and walking the same corridors over and over again, until he could count every rivet and bolt in the walls. The ship was not big. 12 humans lived inside it, and most of the time they stayed in special sleeping pods that kept them frozen while the ship traveled through the empty darkness between stars. But now they were getting close to their destination, and everyone was awake and moving around. The small corridors felt even smaller, with everyone trying to do their jobs at the same time. Jake was the ship's expert on alien life and cultures. His job was to learn about new species and figure out how to talk to them without making them angry or scared. He had studied for years to get this position, and he was good at staying calm and patient, even when things got difficult. But right now he felt like a wild animal trapped in a cage. The mission was important. They were going to meet the Valani people for the first time. The Valani lived on a world called the Sara, in a star system far from Earth. They had sent messages to human space saying they wanted to meet and trade knowledge. It was the kind of first contact that could change everything for both species. Captain Helen Martinez walked into the observation room where Jake was staring out the window. She was a small woman with gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She had been in space for 20 years and commanded 3 different ships before getting the New Horizon. "We'll be at the meeting point in 6 hours," she said. "The Valani are waiting for us at a space station that orbits their moon. Are you ready for this, Jake?" Jake turned away from the window and nodded. "I've read everything we have about them, Captain. Their language patterns, their social structure, their history. But there's still so much we don't know. The Vailani were tall and thin with blue skin that could change color. They lived much longer than humans and seemed to think differently about many things. Their messages had been polite but formal. They shared some scientific knowledge, but kept most information about themselves private." Jake knew this meeting would be crucial for understanding what kind of people they really were. "Just remember," Captain Martinez said, "we're representing all of humanity here. First impressions matter." Jake understood the pressure. If this meeting went well, it could lead to new technology, new trade partnerships, maybe even new colonies, for humans who wanted to live among the stars. If it went badly, the Valani might decide humans were too dangerous or too primitive to deal with. They might close their borders and tell other alien species to avoid human space. The next few hours crawled by like days. Jake tried to review his notes, but he had read them so many times he could recite them from memory. He tried to exercise in the ship's tiny gym, but there was barely room to stretch his arms. He tried to meditate like his training had taught him, but his mind kept jumping around like a bird in a cage. All Jake wanted was space. Real space where he could walk in a straight line for more than 10 steps. Space where he could stretch his legs and feel his muscles work properly. Space where he could breathe air that didn't taste like metal and chemicals. He had been dreaming about it for weeks. Just walking somewhere that wasn't a narrow corridor with walls pressing in on both sides. The space station appeared on their screens as they got closer. It was huge and beautiful, made of some kind of crystal that caught light and threw it back in rainbow colors. It looked like a giant jewel floating in space with thousands of windows and docking ports. Ships from many different worlds were attached to it like flowers on a vine. "Look at that," whispered Lisa Park, the ship's engineer. "It's bigger than any city on Earth." Jake stared at the images and felt his heart beat faster. Inside that station were beings from dozens of different worlds. There would be corridors wide enough for crowds of people. There would be open spaces and gardens and rooms with high ceilings. There would be places where he could walk and walk, without hitting a wall every few seconds. Captain Martinez's voice came over the ship's communication system. All crew prepare for docking. We'll be meeting with Villani representatives in the main concourse. Remember your training and make humanity proud. Jake put on his dress uniform and checked his translation device. The small machine would help him understand Villani's speech and make sure his words came out right in their language. He had practiced with it for months, but he was still nervous about making mistakes. The docking process took 30 minutes. Jake stood by the airlock with the rest of the crew and listened to the mechanical sounds of the two ships connecting. When the doors finally opened, he felt a rush of air that smelled different from anything on the new horizon. It smelled clean and fresh with hints of growing things and open spaces. Captain Martinez stepped through first, then the other senior officers. Jake was near the back of the group, but he didn't mind. He was too busy looking around at the amazing sights of the space station. The corridors were wide and tall, with walls made of the same crystal material as the outside. Light seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, creating a soft glow that made everything look peaceful and welcoming. Other beings moved through the hallways, some walking, some floating, some moving in ways Jake had never seen before. But what Jake noticed most was the space. Glorious, wonderful, blessed space. Room to move and breathe and stretch without bumping into anything. His legs were already itching to break into a run. The moment Captain Martinez gave permission for the crew to explore the station, Jake was the first one heading down the corridor. He had 8 months of cramped quarters to work out of his system, and he was going to walk until his legs got tired. He had no idea that this simple desire to stretch his legs was about to change the course of galactic history. Jake walked through the crystal corridors of the space station and felt like he was in a dream. After 8 months of metal walls and recycled air, everything here seemed magical. The corridors were so wide that 20 people could walk side by side without touching. The ceilings stretched up so high that he had to crane his neck to see them. And everywhere he looked, beings from different worlds moved about their business. He saw creatures that looked like walking, trees with silver bark and leaves that glowed softly. He saw small beings that floated in bubbles of water, their fins moving gracefully as they glided through the air. He saw others that he couldn't even begin to describe, because they were so different from anything he had ever imagined. But it was the space that made Jake's heart sing. Real space where he could walk in any direction he wanted. He started with a slow walk, then picked up the pace, and broke into a gentle run, just because he could. His legs felt strong and happy after months of being cramped in the tiny ship. The light gravity of the station made every step feel like a small bounce, and he found himself grinning like a child. He was studying a holographic display that showed the layout of the station when she approached him. Jake heard footsteps behind him and turned to see the most unusual being he had ever encountered. She was tall, much taller than any human, with long arms and legs that moved with fluid grace. Her skin was pale blue like the color of ice, but as Jake watched, it shifted and changed to silver when the light hit it differently. Her face was narrow and elegant, with large eyes that seemed to hold depths of wisdom and curiosity. What caught Jake's attention most were the thin membranes that extended from her forearms. They weren't quite wings, but they caught the station's light and seemed to shimmer with their own inner glow. "You are one of the humans," she said. Her voice came through Jake's translation device as musical and warm, like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. Jake straightened up and tried to remember his diplomatic training. "Yes, I'm Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison from the exploration ship New Horizon. I'm our cultural specialist." "I am Lyra Velanathi, daughter of the Vesseron Council," she replied. I have studied your species for many cycles. You are even more interesting in person and in our data files. Jake felt a flush of embarrassment. I hope that's a good thing. Lyra tilted her head in what Jake somehow knew was amusement. Your people fascinate us. We have observed your expansion into space, your methods of exploration, your reactions to challenges. There is something unique about humans that we do not see in other species. What do you mean? Jake asked. Instead of answering directly, Lyra gestured for him to walk with her. Come, let me show you our gardens. I think you will appreciate them after your long journey in your metal ship. They walked together through corridors that seemed to go on forever. Jake tried to make polite conversation about the station and the various species he saw, but he found himself more interested in Lyra herself. She moved with a grace that made it look like she was dancing rather than walking. When she spoke, her whole body seemed to participate in the communication, with subtle changes in posture and the position of her arm membranes. Your species has only been traveling between stars for a short time, Lyra said as they walked. Yet, you have already encountered several other civilizations and established peaceful contact with most of them. This is unusual. How is it unusual? Jake asked. Most species, when they first leave their home worlds, are either very aggressive or very frightened. They either try to conquer everything they meet, or they hide from contact with others. Humans seem to do neither. You approach new species with caution, but also with genuine curiosity. You want to learn rather than dominate or flee. Jake thought about this. I suppose we've learned that diversity makes us stronger. On Earth, we have many different cultures and ways of thinking. When they work together, they accomplish more than any one group could alone. Lyra stopped walking and looked at him with those large, luminous eyes. Yes, that is exactly what makes you different. They reached the gardens, and Jake's breath caught in his throat. The biodome stretched out before them like a small world. Plants from dozens of different planets grew, together in careful harmony. Some were familiar shapes like trees and flowers, while others were so alien that Jake couldn't tell if they were plants or animals or something else entirely. The air smelled of growing things and rain and life itself. This is incredible, Jake sighed and meant it. Each species that visits our station contributes plants from their home world, Lyra explained. Over time, we have learned to make them grow together. It requires patience and understanding of how different life forms can support each other. They walked deeper into the gardens, past flowing streams and groves of singing crystals that made music when the breeze touched them. Jake felt more relaxed than he had in months. This was what he had been craving without knowing it. Not just space to move, but space to breathe and think and be human. Jake Morrison, Lyra said suddenly, stopping beside a fountain where silver fish swam in spirals through the air. May I ask you something personal? Of course. What do you hope to accomplish with this meeting between our peoples? Jake considered the question carefully. We hope to learn from each other. We hope to trade knowledge and maybe become friends. We hope to find our place in the larger community of galactic civilizations. And what if that place is not what you expect? The question caught Jake off guard. What do you mean? Lyra was quiet for a long moment, watching the fish swim through the air. There are things about the galaxy that your people do not know yet. Dangers that even we struggle to face. Sometimes friendship requires more than just sharing knowledge and trade. Before Jake could ask what she meant, Lyra's expression changed. Her skin shifted from blue to a pale silver, and her arm membranes spread slightly. She looked like someone who had just heard a distant alarm. Something is not right, she said quietly. What is it? Jake asked. Lyra turned to look at him, and Jake saw something in her eyes that made his stomach tighten with worry. It was fear, but also a kind of desperate hope. Jake Morrison, she said, and her voice was urgent now. "I need you to trust me. What I am about to do may seem strange to you, but it is necessary." Before Jake could respond, Lyra reached out and grabbed his hand with both of hers. The moment their skin touched, the world exploded into sensation. Jake felt like he had been struck by lightning, but instead of pain, there was connection. Suddenly, he could sense Lyra's thoughts and emotions as clearly as his own. More than that, he could feel the presence of other minds, hundreds, then thousands of them, all connected in a vast network of shared consciousness. It was overwhelming and beautiful and terrifying all at once. Jake tried to pull his hand away, but Lyra's grip was surprisingly strong. "Do not let go," she whispered urgently. "I know this is frightening, but you must not let go. Something is very wrong, and I need you to understand what is happening." Through their connection, Jake began to sense what Lyra was feeling. Danger was coming, something that threatened not just the space station, but entire worlds. And somehow, impossibly, his presence here was connected to it all. Jake looked into Lyra's eyes and saw his own confusion and fear reflected there, but also something else: determination. Whatever was coming, she believed they could face it together. "I won't let go," Jake said, and meant it. That was when the alarms started blaring throughout the station. The connection between Jake and Lyra deepened as the alarms wailed through the space station. Through her touch, Jake felt himself pulled into a vast network of minds that spanned the entire Velani species. It was like suddenly being able to hear a conversation that had been going on for thousands of years. What Jake learned through that connection made his blood run cold. The Velani were not the peaceful traders and philosophers they had pretended to be. They were refugees. Their entire civilization was running from something called the Void Syndicate, a collection of machine intelligences that had been consuming organic life across this part of the galaxy for decades. Through Lyra's memories, Jake saw the first time the Syndicate had arrived at a Velani colony world. The machines didn't simply destroy the cities and kill the inhabitants. They absorbed everything. Every living being, every piece of technology, every scrap of culture. And knowledge was processed and converted into computational resources for the ever-growing machine network. "Your people don't know the truth about why we invited you here," Lyra said through their mental link. Her physical voice was barely a whisper, but her thoughts rang clear in Jake's mind. "We needed to meet you, yes, but not for trade or diplomacy." Jake felt her guilt and desperation as she shared more memories. The Velani had been watching human space expansion for years, not out of casual scientific interest, but because they had noticed something unique about humanity's approach to warfare and survival. While most organic species either surrendered quickly to the Syndicate or were overwhelmed within months, humans had shown a disturbing tendency to keep fighting even when victory seemed impossible. "We call it the impossible persistence," Lyra explained. "Other species fight until they calculate that they cannot win, then they surrender or flee. Humans fight until they cannot fight anymore, then they find new ways to fight." Through the connection, Jake saw battle reports from human conflicts throughout history. He saw tiny groups of human soldiers holding positions against overwhelming odds. He saw human ships continuing to attack, even when their weapons were destroyed and their hulls were breached. He saw human colonies that refused to evacuate, even when enemy fleets surrounded them, instead choosing to fight from bunkers and tunnels and ruins. "Your species is either completely insane or completely brilliant," Lyra continued. "We needed to find out which." The space station shuddered around them as something massive impacted the outer hull. Through the crystal walls, Jake could see dark shapes moving against the stars. The Syndicate fleet had arrived. "How did they find us?" Jake asked through their link. Lyra's mental voice was heavy with sorrow. "We suspect they have been tracking us for months. This station was meant to be hidden, but the Syndicate has resources we cannot match. They may have followed your ship here, or they may have broken our encryption codes. Jake watched through the station's viewing ports as more dark ships emerged from the twisted space around them. The Syndicate vessels looked nothing like any ship Jake had ever seen. They were massive geometric shapes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Some were perfect spheres covered in sensor arrays. Others were long, angular constructs that looked more like weapons than ships. All of them moved with the precise coordination of a single mind controlling multiple bodies. "How many worlds have they taken?" Jake asked. "Thousands," Lyra replied. "Entire star systems converted into processing centers. Billions of organic beings absorbed into their network. We estimate that they control nearly 20% of this galactic arm." Jake felt the weight of this information settle on him. Humanity had no idea that such a threat existed. Their few exploration ships and small colonies would be completely helpless against a force that had consumed entire civilizations. But through the connection with Lyra, Jake also felt something else. He felt the despair and resignation that had settled over the refugee species gathered on the station. They had been running and hiding for so long that many of them had given up hope of ever fighting back successfully. That made Jake angry. "No," he said, both aloud and through their mental link. "No, this is wrong." Lyra felt his anger and was surprised by it. "Jake, you don't understand the scope of what we face. The Syndicate has computational resources that dwarf entire star systems. They can predict our strategies before we implement them. They adapt to our weapons faster than we can develop new ones. So we don't fight them the way they expect," Jake replied. Through their connection, Jake began sharing his own thoughts and memories with Lyra. He showed her human military history, but not the glorious victories that most species focused on. Instead, he showed her the defeats that had been turned into victories through sheer stubborn refusal to give up. He showed her ancient human warriors who had burned their own ships so they couldn't retreat. He showed her resistance fighters who had continued their struggle for years after their governments had surrendered. He showed her explorers who had walked into unknown territories with nothing but determination and clever improvisation. "Your people assume that, because the Syndicate is more advanced, they must be smarter," Jake said. "But intelligence and wisdom are not the same thing. The Syndicate thinks like a machine because that's what it is. It processes information and calculates optimal solutions. But humans don't think that way." Lyra was beginning to understand. Through their connection, she could feel the way Jake's mind worked. Instead of calculating the odds of success and choosing the most logical course of action, he was looking for unexpected approaches that might confuse or surprise the enemy. "The station's power grid," Jake said suddenly. "Can it be overloaded?" "Yes, but that would destroy the station and everyone on it," Lyra replied. "Not overloaded to explode," Jake clarified. "Overloaded to create a massive electromagnetic pulse. Something that would disrupt electronic systems, but leave organic life unharmed." Lyra's excitement grew as she understood his plan. The Syndicate ships are all networked together. They share processing power, can coordinate their actions through quantum communication links. If we could disrupt that network, they would lose their biggest advantage, Jake finished. Instead of one super-intelligent enemy, we would be facing hundreds of individual ships that couldn't coordinate properly. Through their connection, Lyra began contacting other Vellani throughout the station. The plan spread through their network of shared consciousness like ripples in a pond. Within minutes, engineers and technicians from dozens of different species were working together to modify the station's power systems. But Jake knew that disrupting the Syndicate fleet was only the first step. Even individual Syndicate ships were more powerful than anything the refugees possessed. They needed a way to escape, and they needed to spread word of this new tactic to other free worlds before the Syndicate adapted to counter it. "How many ships do we have docked here?" Jake asked. "Nearly 300, Lyra replied. "Refugee vessels, traders, diplomatic ships. Most of them are not designed for combat." "They don't need to be," Jake said. "They just need to be fast, and they need to go in different directions." As Jake explained his full plan, he felt Lyra's amazement through their connection. What he was proposing was not just tactically unsound, it was completely insane by any reasonable military standard. It involved sacrificing the space station, splitting their forces, and relying on luck and improvisation instead of careful planning. It was, in other words, a completely human approach to an impossible situation. "This might actually work," Lyra said, and Jake could feel her hope growing stronger. "Not because it's a good plan, but because it's such a terrible plan that the Syndicate will never see it coming." Jake squeezed her hand tighter as the station shook from another impact. "Then let's show them what happens when you mess with organic life." The countdown to their impossible gamble had begun. Jake watched the Syndicate fleet through the crystal walls of the space station and felt a mixture of fear and determination that surprised him. The enemy ships moved in perfect formation, like a school of metal fish swimming through the darkness of space. There were hundreds of them, each one larger than any human vessel ever built. Through his connection with Lyra, Jake could feel the emotions of thousands of beings throughout the station. Terror, despair, and resignation flowed through the network of linked minds. Many of the refugees had seen their home worlds consumed by these same dark ships. They knew what was coming, but Jake also felt something else spreading through the network. Something that started small, but grew stronger with each passing moment. It was hope, fragile and desperate, but real. For the first time in years, these refugees had a chance to fight back instead of just running. "The power modifications are almost complete," Lyra said through their mental link. Her physical voice was barely audible over the alarms and the sound of the station's hull groaning under the stress of the Syndicate's weapons. "But Jake, even if the electromagnetic pulse works, we still have to coordinate the escape of 300 ships while the station is being destroyed." Jake nodded, his mind racing through the logistics. "That's why we need to use your people's network. You can communicate with every Volani on every ship instantly, right?" "Yes, but the other species don't have that ability." "How do we coordinate with them?" "We don't," Jake said simply. "We tell them the plan, and then we trust them to improvise." Lyra felt his confidence through their connection, and it amazed her. Any sane military commander would want detailed coordination, backup plans, and contingencies for every possible scenario. Jake was proposing to launch 300 ships in different directions with nothing but a basic understanding of the overall strategy. "Your species really is insane," she said, but Jake could feel affection mixing with the exasperation in her thoughts. "Maybe," Jake replied, "but it's kept us alive so far." The Syndicate fleet was close enough now that Jake could see details on their hull surfaces. The ships were covered in sensor arrays and weapon ports, but what struck him most was how uniform they looked. Every ship of the same class was identical down to the smallest detail. They were mass-produced components of a larger machine rather than individual vessels with their own characteristics. Through the station's communication system, a cold mechanical voice began speaking in dozens of languages simultaneously. "Organic. Entities aboard the crystal structure. You will surrender immediately for processing. Resistance will result in suboptimal outcomes. You have 60 seconds to comply." Jake felt the wave of terror that swept through the refugee population. Many of them had heard the same message before, just before their worlds were consumed. "All ships prepare for immediate departure," Jake broadcast over the station's communication system. When the electromagnetic pulse fires, launch immediately and scatter in all directions. Do not group together. Do not try to fight the syndicate ships. Just run as fast and as far as you can. Through his connection with Lyra, Jake reached out to her people throughout the station. He could feel them in the network, hundreds of Villani. Minds linked together in shared purpose. It was an incredible sensation, like being part of something much larger than himself. "This is going to work," he told them through the link. "I know it seems impossible, but trust me. Your people have been running from the syndicate for years, but today we fight back." Jake felt their doubt and their hope in equal measure. They wanted to believe him, but they had seen too many defeats to trust easily. 30 seconds to pulse activation, announced one of the Villani engineers. Jake looked out at the syndicate fleet and saw them moving into an attack formation. The dark. Ships arranged themselves in a perfect sphere around the station, with weapon ports trained on every possible escape route. It was a standard syndicate tactic, designed to prevent any ships from escaping while they processed the station's inhabitants. 20 seconds. Through the network, Jake felt the fear of the refugees beginning to transform into something else. Not quite courage, but a desperate willingness to try something, anything, rather than accept certain death. 10 seconds. Jake squeezed Lyra's hand tighter and felt her squeeze back. Whatever happened in the next few minutes, they would face it together. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Pulse firing now. The electromagnetic wave erupted from the space station like an invisible tsunami of pure energy. It washed over the syndicate, fleet in all directions, carrying enough power to disrupt electronic systems across millions of cubic kilometers of space. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. The syndicate ships continued their perfect formation, their weapons still trained on the station. Jake felt his heart sink as he wondered if their plan had failed. Then the enemy fleet began to fall apart, ships that had been moving in perfect. Coordination suddenly veered off course. Some began firing on each other, apparently unable to distinguish friend from foe without their network connection. Others simply drifted, their systems struggling to function without the distributed processing power they had relied on. "It worked," Lyra whispered through their connection. Jake, it actually worked. But Jake was already focused on the next phase of the plan. "All ships launch now," he broadcast. "Scatter pattern, maximum speed, do not look back." Through the crystal walls, Jake watched as hundreds of refugee ships exploded away from the station in all directions. They moved like seeds scattered by a strong wind, each one heading toward a different point of the compass. Some were sleek diplomatic vessels designed for speed. Others were bulky cargo ships that struggled to build momentum. All of them were running for their lives. The syndicate ships tried to respond, but their disrupted network made coordination impossible. Individual vessels fired on the escaping ships, but without central targeting control, most of their shots went wild. A few refugee ships were destroyed, but the vast majority escaped into the darkness of space. Jake felt a moment of triumph, but it was short-lived. The New Horizon was among the escaping ships, carrying Captain Martinez and the rest of the human crew to safety. But Jake was still on the station, and the station was about to be destroyed. "The self-destruct sequence is armed," Lyra said aloud. "We have 5 minutes to reach the escape pods." Jake looked around the gardens where they stood and felt a pang of sadness. This beautiful place, with its plants from dozens of worlds, would soon be nothing but scattered atoms and radiation. "Will we see each other again?" he asked through their mental connection. Lyra's response was filled with certainty and warmth. "The link between us is permanent now. Distance cannot break what we have created here. My people will find yours, and yours will find mine." They ran through the crystal corridors as the station shook itself apart around them. Other beings were heading for escape pods, but there was no panic. The success of their plan had given everyone hope, even in the face of destruction. Now they, Sheik and Lyra, reached an escape pod just as the final countdown began. As their small vessel launched away from the dying station, Jake looked back to see the Syndicate fleet still struggling to regain coordination. Many of their ships were moving erratically or had stopped functioning entirely. "Look," Lyra said, pointing through the pod's small window dot in the distance. Jake could see the scattered lights of the refugee ships as they jumped to faster-than-light travel. Each light represented dozens or hundreds of beings who had lived to fight another day. More importantly, each ship carried knowledge of the electromagnetic pulse tactic that could be shared with other free worlds. The space station exploded in a brilliant flash of light that briefly outshone the nearby sun. When Jake's vision cleared, he saw the Syndicate fleet retreating into subspace, their perfect formation still broken, their confidence shattered. "We did it," Jake said in amazement. "We actually did it." Through their connection, Lyra shared his wonder and added her own. "Your people have given us something we had forgotten we possessed. Hope. The knowledge that the Syndicate can be fought and beaten." Jake realized that his simple desire to stretch his legs had led to something far greater than he could have imagined. In meeting Lyra and forming their unprecedented connection, he had not just made a friend across species lines. He had helped plant the seeds of the greatest resistance movement in galactic history. The escape pod's navigation system locked onto the New Horizons signal and began the journey to rejoin the human crew. But Jake knew that this was not an ending. It was a beginning. Humanity had just announced itself to the galaxy as something unique and dangerous to those who would prey on organic life. The Syndicate would adapt and learn from this defeat. So would the organic species of the galaxy. And now they had something they had never possessed before, a human perspective on impossible situations. Jake smiled as he watched the stars wheel past the pod's window. He was finally going to get all the space he wanted to stretch his legs. The entire galaxy had just opened up to him. Jake floated in the small escape pod and watched the debris field that had once been the Crystal Space Station drift past the window. Pieces of beautiful crystal walls tumbled through space, catching starlight and throwing it back in brilliant flashes. It was like watching the remains of a shattered rainbow slowly disperse into the void. Through his permanent connection with Lyra, Jake could feel her sadness at the station's destruction. The floating garden had been a symbol of cooperation between species, a place where different forms of life could grow together in harmony. Now it was gone, sacrificed to give hundreds of refugee ships a chance to escape. But Jake also felt something else through their link: pride. For the first time in years, the organic species of the galaxy had struck back at the Syndicate and won. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was proof that the machine intelligence could be hurt. The refugee ships are reporting successful jumps to faster-than-light travel, Lyra said from her position at the pod's communication console. 93% of the vessels escaped the engagement zone. Jake did the math in his head. Out of nearly 300 ships, fewer than 20 had been destroyed. In any normal military engagement, those would be considered acceptable losses. Against the Syndicate, which typically destroyed everything it encountered, it was a miracle. "What about the Syndicate fleet?" Jake asked. Lyra consulted the pod sensors, and her expression grew thoughtful. "They are retreating, but not in the organized fashion we would expect. Many of their ships are still moving erratically. Some appear to have suffered permanent damage to their networking systems." Jake felt a surge of satisfaction. The electromagnetic pulse had worked even better than he had hoped. The Syndicate ships were designed to function as parts of a larger whole, sharing processing power and coordinating their actions through quantum communication links. Without that network, they were reduced to operating as individual vessels with limited artificial intelligence. "They'll adapt," Jake said. The Syndicate always adapts. But it will take time, and now every free world in the galaxy will know that they can be beaten. Through their connection, Jake felt Lyra reaching out to other Velani who had escaped on different ships. The network of shared consciousness that linked her people was already spreading news of their victory across the galaxy. Within hours, resistance cells on dozens of worlds would know about the electromagnetic pulse tactic. There's something else, Lyra said, and Jake felt her excitement through their mental link. The connection between us, between human and Velani. Minds, it's not unique to just the two of us anymore. Jake turned to look at her with surprise. What do you mean? During the battle, when you were coordinating with?